This playlist will collect together and organize the individual component modules, which together will comprise the first of 2 lectures covering the material on arguments in our readings. Over the course of these, the story arc for the 2 lecture sequence will go pretty much as follows. We're going to begin by talking about arguments, specifically the sorts of uses that human beings have for arguments, why they're so important, and a general characterization of arguments. Then we'll turn our attention to the basic constitutive elements of arguments, statements. After which, we'll then focus on the structure and function of arguments, followed by talking about how to identify whether or not a bit of spoken or written language contains an argument and how to go about extracting that argument from that bit of spoken or written language and putting it into its best format, extracting the argument. And then finally, we'll end that second lecture with our first method for evaluating arguments, the counterexample method for evaluating the validity of deductive arguments. Pivoting to our first point in the lecture series, we're going to start then by talking about arguments. We'll talk about why it is that arguments are so incredibly important. We'll characterize arguments. What exactly are arguments and how do we differentiate them from other bits of spoken language or written language? Then we'll talk about the relationship between arguments and the formal sciences that study how best to produce and evaluate those kinds of arguments. And specifically, we'll break arguments up as having 2 aspects. On the one hand, they have their content elements, and on the other hand, they have their form elements. And we'll talk about how a good deductive or inductive argument actually has both good content, good initial information, and good logical form, good underlying structural relationships between those bits of information. So what are arguments? Well, oftentimes we think of arguments in this sort of vein, as verbal fights or disputations. You suck. No, you suck. But in fact, this isn't what we want to think of as arguments at all. This is as far away from real arguments in the context of our course as you can possibly get. Why is that? Well, to start, despite the verbal and intellectual acumen of Beavis and Butthead's Promethean discourse, they failed to engage each other in a constructive and informed fashion. For our purposes, arguments are artifacts. And no, that doesn't mean that they are old and that no one cares about them. To the contrary, what this means, as Bertrand Russell, the English philosopher and logician, will tell us, is that arguments are human creations. They are tools. And like all tools, they are created for specific purposes. In fact, humans have even created sciences to study how best to make and use arguments. And not even just one science, several sciences. Now, if we want to be specific about the nature of arguments, arguments are structured collections, that is more than one with a structure relating them, of statements. Indeed, if we want to be really specific and really accurate in characterizing arguments, we would have to say that arguments are structured collections of statements that function as models of inferences. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, there are a bunch of metaphors that we can draw on to help us understand that relationship. Arguments are sort of like trails. They start us off at a set of initial information and they guide us from that initial information to a conclusion in the same way that an inference would transform our initial information, take us from that initial information to the conclusion. Arguments are like maps. They show us how to get from a particular beginning point, from an initial set of information, to some other conclusion, to some other bit of information. They show us one, possibly more, ways to arrive at a different destination from our original position. But probably the most apt metaphor, to my mind, is that arguments are like the stepping stone bridges that allow us to traverse things like rivers. Because arguments don't just take us from initial information to conclusion. They are structured collections of statements. They arrange the content in such a way so that each individual step that we take, each movement that we make from the initial start of our argument to the ultimate conclusion is a step map that we can easily see and we can easily make. Arguments highlight how best to get from point A to B in a very, very specific manner.